Started in 2010. I'm really happy to be here. I still get a little bit of like stress feeling when I walk in this room, thinking that I have something to read or write or do. So forgive me. I'm also a policy advisor for the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services, and I'm going to be teaching some courses in our Restorative Justice Master's program on adversity, trauma, and victimization and victim rights. And I teach in the GPP program as well, doing the Family Law Lab. So I love VLS. I love spending time here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to give back to the institution in this way. So I just want to take a minute, because I know we're at the end of a really long day talking about really heady and weighty things. Can you just take a second and smile at the person next to you or across from you? Just take a minute. There's science on that, like lifting the corners of your mouth, even if you're not intentionally feeling happy or smiley, it can just help. And I just want to help us lift ourselves, because these are serious and important topics, but we shouldn't carry them in our bodies. So let's just let it out a little bit. I'm coming off of, this morning moderating a different panel for the Bar Association. It was a similar kind of vibe, and I just want to relax a little bit. Okay, so my current work is focused on the experience of trauma and victimization and how we can support healing for individuals and healing for our community. And so many of the policy issues that come up in victim survivor work here in Vermont circle around issues of mental health. Certainly trauma, especially complex and recurring trauma, can deeply impact a person's emotional life and their mental health. And improving access to mental health treatment is a major priority for victim service professionals. But we also know that individuals living with serious mental illness in particular are more vulnerable to victimization, anywhere from 2 times more likely than the general population to be victimized to 140 times more likely by some estimates. Women with serious mental illness are even more likely to be victimized. And for a host of complex reasons, victims living with mental illness are less likely to report their experiences to law enforcement. They're less likely to follow through with other opportunities for protection, other opportunities to obtain services. And so that's another major goal of the sort of victim services cadre of folks is to look at ways that we can do a better job of serving underserved populations and making sure that everyone has access to what they need. There's also another nexus. There's a difficult set of cases for people who work in victim advocacy, and these are the cases that involve defendants who are living with a mental illness themselves, and they are in need of mental health treatment. They may have experienced trauma and victimization during the course of their own lives. And despite the large numbers of people who living with mental illness who cycle through the criminal justice system, it's no secret there, the system wasn't designed for these cases. And you're going to hear about that a little bit today. The results that people see in the community can be confusing and frustrating, especially when we're socialized to believe that incarceration is justice. If victims and survivors have anything in common, though, it's a hope for no new victims, and that's where restorative justice fits in, and that's why I'm so happy to be able to moderate this panel today and help you all learn from this really diverse and interesting group of panelists. They all come from very different backgrounds in terms of their professional training, but I think you're going to see a really beautiful thread that weaves through all of their work. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alexander Carre. He's the Director of Outpatient Services at Day Kimball Health Care Center in Putnam, Connecticut. Inpatient, I'm sorry. The inpatient services. And he began his career in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, serving the Ministry of Health. And he immigrated to the U.S. in 1982. He's practiced psychiatric medicine for 30 years, including serving the state of Connecticut as a forensic psychiatrist. He's also an Air National Guard veteran with 10 years of experience as a flight surgeon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carre.
Oh, I had just begun by preparing a little something, such as the correction that I am the Director of Inpatient Psychiatric Services at Day Kimball Hospital. I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you for inviting me to the Convention about Mental Health and the Law. As previously stated, I've worked at a large state facility called Connecticut Valley Hospital from 1985 to 2014. And after state service, I briefly worked at Charlotte Hungerford Hospital in Torrington, Connecticut, until my current position at Day Kimball. And for 12 years, while I was at Connecticut Valley Hospital, I worked in the forensic division called the Whiting Forensic Services. I just wanted to share with you the extent of my professional life, whereas at least one of you knows me by the title and also the qualitative compliment of Dad. I must also add that I do not represent any organization, but my own personal and professional views on things, and I have no endorsement. In speaking to one of your organizers about my own topic, the expression restorative justice seemed to lack precision to a mental health professional. So I wanted to share with you in its stead my thoughts regarding 34 years of practice in the mental health profession. And of course, I don't have any visual aid, and I wish at some point to engage the audience in a dialogue about mental health treatment, as the other panelists sure have planned to do. In the topic of mental health treatment intersecting with the law in a manner we hope that would not generate further trauma. There are certain paradigms that one has to think of and consider in approaching the issue of trauma, and particularly from an institutional, sociocultural point of view. And not by order of importance, since they are all important. There is the paradigm of school to prison. The child begins to be targeted, so to speak, and I don't want to use the word harassed, but it could be seen as harassment. And all of a sudden, a certain aura of bad reputation follows the kid, and the kid is being punished more often, suspended more often than his peers, and you prep him to have a negative view of himself. So when he's about to reach adulthood, you just prepare somebody who's going to go to prison and perpetuates that thought. That's one of the paradigm that I have witnessed, and particularly when it hits a segment of the population that is non-white. There is also the paradigm of sex equality, legal representation in the criminal and the civil system, and that continues this way. Victims of domestic and sexual violence, rights of LGBT, or the non-rights, as we see in the armed forces nowadays, the limitation and the restrictions that were, if not suggested, but about to be added. Police brutality. Now, when you talk about PTSD, I don't know if you have had that definition and what it is like. You did, so wonderful. So you know about the intrusive thoughts, the avoidance, and the negative alteration of cognition and the alteration of arousal and reactivity. I don't need to go into. And of course, it's all based on, it's biologically supported. So the question then is what to do with that, all these paradigms. How can we conceptualize a way to diminish the effect of the trauma in those victims, particularly when the traumas have been seen as institutional. There is a paradigm that I should mention. A journalist in 1960 called Hannah Arendt went to Israel to witness and document and write an article about the trial of Adolf Eichmann. During the trial, she made that observation and concluded that there was a sense of banality of evil that she picked up when she listened to that otherwise insignificant individual saying in an almost casual way, describing what he has done during his tenure and being one of the major cogs in the wheels of the Holocaust. She picked up that and described the banality of evil. And this is the same banality that permeates all the biases that we have witnessed, so it becomes natural, if not accepted. We cannot sit and accept them again and again. We cannot accept the banality of evil. Therefore, we must do something to correct that situation, to change that cognition, and offer to the victims a sense of regain integrity so they can continue to be, or if they haven't been, to become useful members of society. I think I overspoken. No. I'm sorry. but those are the things that bring a bit of passion into the end of my professional life. Thank you, and I.
Thanks. So next I'd like to introduce Professor Anna Saxman, probably familiar to many of you. She is a member of Vermont Law School's famous class of 1985. As an attorney practicing out in Vermont, for some of you who will stick around, you go out and about, you're going to run into members of the class of 1985. They're doing really great things, and they're everywhere. It's another one of those stories about sort of the power of going to VLS, actually, just how amazing it is that how connected we are, and the great things that people end up doing for Vermont. And Anna, Professor Saxman, is one of them. She's represented criminal defendants in Vermont for over 25 years and argued more than 80 appeals before the Vermont Supreme Court. She began teaching as an adjunct here at VLS in 1995. She's taught just about every class having any brush with criminal law, as far as I can tell. And she currently serves as the Director of Training for the Vermont Defender General. She's particularly interested in the intersection of criminal law and mental health law and has published 2 articles on the subject in Psychology, Public Policy, and the Law. And she also offers seminars on these issues at the University of Vermont and Dartmouth-Hitchcock Departments of Psychiatry, and the Vermont and New Hampshire Psychological Associations. So thank you, Professor Saxman.
Thank you. Long training of court. I have to stand up to speak, and I need a podium. So I want to discuss some trauma issues and possibly some solutions where, of course, my vantage point is that I have represented criminal defendants for 25 years, and I learned that the labels are interchangeable. Defendant, victim, often the same person. And so many of my clients were victims. I believe the word trauma comes from a Greek word to wound or for wound, and so many of the people I represented are wounded, injured, and suffering like the victims that other people are taking care of. So I want to talk about what I refer to as therapeutic jurisprudence. Because what do we do with a person who has been seriously victimized? I don't want to talk about using dissociation or PTSD as an excuse or a defense. What I'm talking about is, what do we do? The national data suggests that at least 75% of incarcerated men and women have experienced interpersonal violence, abuse, childhood neglect, or abandonment. You may know that the United States Supreme Court law says in a capital case, a death penalty case, that defenders have a duty to look at all the information about the defendant: childhood, education, psychological evaluation, MRIs of the brain, everything. But in the non-death penalty cases, courts aren't interested in what really happened to this individual. And I'm sorry to say, in many cases, the lawyers haven't been. So I'm suggesting that understanding what happened to individual trauma victim defendants is really important. And it's important for several reasons. Uncovering why someone had these responses, committed serious offenses, may be helpful, number one, in getting them some help. Number two, crafting a sentence so that whatever crime it was will never happen again. And the more you know, and I'm happy to say that I have put this into practice. I was always drawn to the cases with psychological issues in them. And I find that if you really get deep and informed about a client's history, and these are very sad cases, as you know from talking to victims who weren't defendants. They're really sad and they're shocking. And it's hard sometimes for a lawyer, busy lawyer, got to do this, got to do that, yeah, okay, we're going in for the bail hearing, to take the time to be a compassionate listener. And many young men faced with jail are not going to reveal their trauma history easily. I mean, look how long it took many of the priest abuse survivors to come forward. There's a big stigma, and if a man is about to go into jail, certainly does not want that to follow him. But that's another thing. People who have, as you all know, may have hypervigilance. Someone approaches them and puts their hands on them. It may completely freak them out. I had a case of a young man, pretty much what Dr. Carey was saying, who was on the autism spectrum, and a substitute teacher was there one day, and he wasn't obeying something or clearly doing what he was supposed to do. So she put her hands on him, and she, sort of grabbed him and said, "Go sit down." Well, he freaked out, pushed her away. She fell backwards. She hit herself on a desk. And the next thing we know, there's a criminal charge. And if we hadn't been able to actually get his school records, his IEP, individual educational plan, and then we talked to the special ed director for that district. She said that should never have happened. It's in his IEP. He's not supposed to be touched. And that helped tremendously. Even though the prosecutor did not want to give up, did not want to give him a break, it was helpful to the judge to understand what should happen. So these are the kinds of things that I think as public defenders we have a tremendous obligation to do. And there's a great clinical professor at Yale who is advocating just exactly that. How do we get an indifferent, at times indifferent judiciary or indifferent or even hostile prosecution to listen? We need to do the work. We need to establish the role that abuse may have happened, the particular effects of trauma on an individual. As I said, it's not an excuse. And as Brian Stevenson says, we need to get close to the clients. We have to get to know them, we have to investigate. And how many public defenders have the time? Well, I think we have to make the time. I can tell you lots of stories. You probably already know them. But one thing that I wanted to point out, which is law schools have or present an excellent opportunity for pioneering best practices for trauma-informed defense sentencing practices. They could have, mitigation clinics. Experienced attorneys will work there. Vermont Law School did have a successful small criminal law clinic with both prosecutor and defense placements, but perhaps we'll have it again. Meanwhile, working with the Restorative Justice Program to make sure that all lawyers will be able to talk and compassionately listen to their clients, get the records, get the evaluation. It's highly important that courts who are sentencing know this about the defendants. So there are some very exciting things. We can talk about them later that are happening around the country. And this is a good time, I think, to be an attorney. Oh, thank you. I'll probably talk too long.
Okay. And I should mention as well, one of our panelists isn't available this afternoon. I have a hunch this is Chief Caston from Hartford. He might be out on the roads, I'm gonna guess. Our last speaker is Dr. Mel Hall, a scholar activist who builds connections across disciplines ranging from sustainable agriculture, women's empowerment, Black feminist theory, community development, and international relations. Inspired by her dissertation work with Black, Indigenous, Garifuna communities in Honduras, Dr. Hall participated in the Black and Latinx Farmers Immersion Program at Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York, and has continued to work in solidarity with farmers in the United States and Honduras. Currently, Dr. Hall is a visiting scholar at Brandeis University's Women's Studies Research Center. There's a lot that she's doing all the while.
We can wrap it up there. They can read the
she's
bio.
a doctoral faculty member at the School of Leadership Studies for the Fielding Graduate University, and also, and this was the one thing that I was so interested in speaking with her about before the presentation, a member of Dark Room, a Women of Color faculty seminar on race and visual studies. And also, she's a member of Soulfire Farm Speakers Collective. So very happy to welcome you here to Vermont Law School.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here, and I have to say that I'm here as part of Soulfire Farm Speaker Collective. So that's what I first want to say. And so Soulfire Farm is a farm in upstate New York, in Grafton, New York, that is working on ending racism and injustice in the food system. Leah Penniman is one of the co-founding farmers. Her book is recently out, Farming While Black. The subtitle is Soulfire Farm's Practical Guide to Liberation on the Land. And one of the things that, so I'm speaking sort of as a part of that collective. So I want to say that because the invitation came to the collective, and so the way it works is that anyone can sort of respond to a call for someone who wants someone from this group to come. And this is an interesting place to end up. A lot of times I'm at farms or something like that. I realize I'm underdressed for a law school, apparently. And but one of the ways that Leah often starts things is with a sort of dedication. I'm going to read the dedication at the beginning of the book, and then I'm going to ask us to do something. So it reads, "This book is dedicated to our ancestral grandmothers who braided seeds in their hair before being forced to board transatlantic slave ships, believing against the odds in a future of sovereignty on land." And there's a beautiful sort of art piece. And I started that because often when I'm in a group like this with different people, I don't know anyone in this room before coming today. Is one of the things that Leah often asks people to do is to say the name of the person or people who are inspiring them in the work they're doing. And so I'm going to ask you all to do that. So some of you are coming to this work because you have certain ideas about what justice should look like. Some of you because you're inspired by lawyers who you know or by family members. I'm not sure why you are all here in this law school and in this place, but I'd like you to think about that, like who's the person or people or community that inspires you. And on the count of three, I'd like for us to say sort of the name of the person who is sort of moving us through in this work. And that person can be alive or deceased. So 1, 2, 3. This is quick. All right. And so that's just, I mean, it might, if you haven't done that practice before, but it's a way of sort of bringing those people into the room to remind us sort of our work and why we're here and what we're doing, which you know better than I do. But I thought about it in particular when the keynote talk said something about empowering. In the wording was trauma victims through shared decision making. But what I thought and what I sort of edited it to be was, instead of victims, using survivors in light of one of the later talks we heard, and also thinking about not just shared decision-making, but also other processes and practices. So what does it mean to bring into this room a different, like different kinds of practices, to engage people in a different way? And there are all these things that I thought about when I was here, because I was like, I'm at this educational event, but I was like, for me, I teach students, but in a formal college and university, but also I'm a popular educator. And so I'm someone who thinks that much of the education, much of what we learn, much of what we need to know doesn't come in colleges and universities. So what does that mean to be up here? I definitely make a distinction between law and justice. So what does it mean to be on a panel about any kind of justice? You know what I mean? And talk about the distinction between that and law. And then, like, I'm up here on this stage, and I just, like, talking about hierarchies. And I mean, we've had some of that conversation earlier about how we frame discussions. And when I come someplace, it's not as much to teach as to learn. And so all day, and I'm sorry I was late because of I didn't expect a spring snowstorm, but I've sort of been taking note of all the things I've been learning. Coleman earlier was talking about racial trauma woven into the fabric of the country, and that's a history that the farm and others with whom I work really roots in. We've talked a little bit about language. Leah Penniman uses the term food apartheid, not food desert. So in some, I mean, I wish you were like more closer and people were used to like talking, but I mean, you might imagine why. I mean, it really gives deserts a bad name. I mean, I don't know if any of you are from desert regions, but things grow in deserts. Deserts are naturally occurring. There's nothing wrong with a desert. But by the time you talk about living in a food apartheid, then you've got a whole other set of questions to ask, right? So then we had a discussion about co-witnessing. And I thought about it, and that was a literature person, and I thought about it because I'm in this group, the dark room is people who are thinking about a lot of the people in the dark room are in the humanities and literary sciences, but I think about the visual, and I'm struck here because I'm sitting. Have any of you gone upstairs and looked at the murals? Okay. ... Somebody ask me a question later. Okay, so because I know I'm going to run out of time, but I was thinking about the Transformation Center and the idea of preventing violence and promoting compassion. I was thinking about what it means to be doing peer support. Who are our peers? Like, am I a peer? I'm up here on this stage. I got this big mic. I can, is somebody going to take it? Am I going to talk too long? I mean, there are all these sort of questions. I was thinking about the idea of vicarious trauma that was talked about earlier in the mindfulness discussion. I was thinking, how do you know if you're the target or not? And then I was thinking about when people talk about justice for someone, at what point does it become justice for everyone, right? So when is it not a problem that person got hurt? But what if you decided you don't want to live in a world with prisons? What if that's your justice issue because you've decided that that's not okay, the same way you don't want to live in a world with a Holocaust or an apartheid or present-day prison system? Anyway, so just thinking about that, and then one of the other things I thought about was like how people are invoking we in this environment, the different we's, whether or not we're talking about entitlement to happiness, a conversation of rights and privileges that came up, whether we talk about the real world, whose world gets to be real? Is it yours? Whether or not we're talking about things becoming natural and what we accept, who accepts, right? And so I'm just thinking about the importance of perspective and wanting to learn here and to I was so surprised. I was like, this is such an interesting conference to sort of request the presence of a network of food justice activists. But then I thought about, like, if you're focusing on the justice piece, then it makes sense. And especially if you think about restorative justice, if you think about restore, if you think about repair, if you think about reparations, and you think about what that looks like for different people in this place, that's both a legal question, it's a question of food, it's a question of land, and also it's a question of healing. So I'm going to end with, Leah Penniman has a chapter in the book that is dedicated to healing from trauma. And I'm just going to read this one part from it. And I thought about this particular paragraph because the subtitle is Today's Environmental Gap, and I know that, that environmental laws are big here. It's not just in Flint where Black families experience disproportionate environmental burdens. A preponderance of research shows that environmental racism is alive and well in America. Environmental toxins such as lead, polychlorinated phenols, volatile organic compounds, and organophosphate pesticides are differentially concentrated in areas where Black and poor children live and go to school. Predominantly Black communities are located closer to hazardous waste facilities than white communities. These exposures lead to a 47% higher asthma rate for Black people as compared with whites, as well as increased cancer risk. Environmental benefits are also experienced unequally. While Black neighborhoods were bulldozed to create parks across the nation during urban renewal, Black people enjoy less time in those parks and wild spaces. The nation's original parks explicitly excluded people of color, and today Black people are more likely to attend schools without green spaces, live in neighborhoods without parks, and lack the resources to travel to quote-unquote pristine wild spaces for recreation. Children's diminished contact with nature increases their chances for depression, learning disabilities, obesity, diabetes, heart diseases, academic underperformance, stress, and social anxiety. Further, a history of sundown towns, lynching, and other racist violence in rural spaces has engendered a generational fear of wilderness. Thank you.
So I think one of the places where I'd like to start, I think that when we talk about restorative justice, when people who aren't involved in the field tend to think about restorative justice, a lot of people are thinking about a program that's a place where a criminal case goes. Like, nod your head if like you're familiar with that conceptualization of like, this is restorative justice, because that's the way, I mean, I don't, that's not my definition of restorative justice, but I think that's the way that it's living in a lot of our communities right now, which is great, and they do tremendous work. But I think part of what our panelists can offer is a sense of like, what does restorative practice look like? Because I think that that's something that all of us can be doing today and tomorrow and the first day at your first law job, as opposed to going to work at the place where the restorative justice happens. Because I feel like what's common in our panelists is the way that they bring restorative practice to their work. I'll jump in at once.
Are you asking us or the
Yeah, I'm
audience?
asking you, yeah. Yeah.
All right, so, I mean, I had already, you know, sort of made the connection here to reparations, and I also note that Soul Fire Farm has a reparations map on its website. But one of the things that that often I realize that people are talking about something that happened recently and something that is sort of the framing isn't necessarily sort of as long term as I often want it to be when we're thinking about restoring and repairing, and so. I think when I'm thinking about it, I'm often thinking about reparations and justice in the long term. I'm often thinking about end to institutions that have their roots in injustice or the extension of slavery. I'm thinking about the prison system right now. I'm thinking about I imagine that lots of people in here have read New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, or Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, or maybe even the more recent American Prison by Shane Bauer. But I mean, thinking about like systems that clearly are an extension, clearly are an extension of enslavement. It's unimaginable, but the reality that we live in a place where somehow that, that's the system. And so for me, just if I were giving something easy, it would be something like ending that system. I've also talked in other contexts about practices like inheritance that perpetuate wealth-based, race-based wealth gaps. And sometimes people don't hear me when I say that, so I just want to repeat it again, ending the practice of inheritance. Some people say, oh, you mean lowering the taxes? And no. So just two things, ending prison systems and, ending inheritance.
Go ahead. Oh, we've been joined, by the way, by Chief Caston, who's here now. Thank you.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. Apologize.
Yeah. Well, we were just starting to talk about, and we'll wrap up this question, and then we'll come back around and take your remarks, because we'd love to hear from you. And I'd like to introduce you more formally to the group. But we were talking about how to bring how our panelists have brought restorative practice and practices to the work in the day-to-day, as opposed to creating programs and that sort of thing. What does practice look like?
Well, who are the people who end up in the criminal justice system? The poor, people of color, people with mental health problems, and for some reason we've accepted that those people should be somehow, punished.
Some we's have accepted.
Well, yeah, okay. When I say we, I mean, the culture.
No, but we invoke it. We reify it sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how can we challenge that notion in a meaningful way in our legal career or however? Well, you can fight for justice.
from my standpoint, having been for having worked in a forensic unit for over 12 years, for having been involved in the continuous flow of patients coming to me for 5-10 days and get out to the community, to come back several times in a row as quote-unquote recidivists, having people who have been committed to the state facility after being convicted of a crime for a maximum of 60 years, you start wondering, at which point do you determine that justice has been served? And what is justice, if you ask me? Is that a retribution that is way out of proportion with the crime that, for which that person has been convicted? At which point does the recovery start? Does that person have a chance to come back after so many years of saying, I'm sorry, I won't do it again? At which point does that person convince society that it's okay for him or her to be welcome back? Is there a set of rules, a set of criteria that we have that will say, okay, that person is okay to come back, or justice has been served and it's time now to come back? We don't have those questions because these methods or these thinkings have not been standardized, nor have they been practiced in real time. And I don't know really who should spearhead this movement. But if I had my druthers, I would start with the legal profession, because it's the legal profession, help with the legislature, that writes the law, that writes the sentences. And I am a proponent that not only would the lawyers start this movement, but they would also allow us clinicians to offer our thoughts, suggestions, and so they can have a fairer idea of what we would give a prognostic value to the judgment that they make.
Great. Well, Chief, are you ready to speak to folks? I'd love to introduce you to the group, and I know you're like just getting settled in here, but we were all assuming that you're out helping folks on the road. Chief Phil Caston is the Chief of Police for the very geographically large town of Hartford, Vermont. There are 5 villages of Hartford.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. And he is also a Marine Corps veteran who has more than 20 years of experience in law enforcement. Prior to moving to Vermont, Chief spent 15 years working for Maryland County Sheriff's Office, where he was responsible for general policing, court process and transport, and corrections. And his work in Maryland, he says, confirmed his belief in crime prevention, which has been the focus of his leadership for the past 4 years in Hartford. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Again, I'm very sorry to everybody. I apologize for interrupting, for being late today. It's a privilege to be here and to speak with you and join the group today about this important issue. And I think when we talk about criminal justice, when we talk about policing, when we talk about corrections, we can never lose sight of the fact that we're talking about people. And that's easy to do because folks get hurt, and we look at crimes and we talk about crimes and the people that get hurt, but we can't talk about criminals without talking about the people that are involved in either representing them, caring for them when they're in the correctional system, or helping them re-enter back into society. And we can't talk about victims unless we talk about the police. We can't talk about the things that lead to victimology and some of the medical issues, mental health issues that go into that. So really, at the end of the day, it all comes back to people. And I think sometimes the system itself, through no intention of its own, because bureaucracy is what it is, puts us into a position where we forget about the people that are involved in these processes. One unique thing that really shaped me, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, was my time with a full-service sheriff's office. So I started my policing career in a smaller municipality, very similar to Hartford, and I say a smaller municipality because the bulk of my career was spent at the county level with a full-service sheriff's office where we were responsible for policing. We had 3 courthouses that we provided support services and security to, and then we had a detention center. At any point in time, we had about 400 persons remanded to our custody. Anywhere from about 250 to 280 of them were under our roof in some level of secure, semi-secure supervision, or they were in a community-based program. Pretrial services were handled remotely. But I think the really cool thing was, and I coached football, I coached baseball for a number of years. I have 4 kids. But we relied on a tiered process inside the detention center to help our folks return to the community. So as they stayed with us, they would demonstrate that they were responsible. They'd get the opportunity to take on more privileges, first within the facility, then on to what we called the complex or compound, and then off the compound, and ultimately work them into some type of work release, home detention, that type of process. And I had the opportunity because folks that worked inside the facility, when I became an administrator, they handled all of the maintenance inside the facility, and we would interact with them. And interesting to hear about people's kids, people's interests. There was a young man from Georgia that I interacted with at one point, and we just hit it off and talked about football. And to this day, I remember him. It was the draft year that Des Bryant was drafted to the Dallas Cowboys. And he had a lot of interest in following Des Bryant through college. But it really changed my thought process somewhat, and I felt like I needed to learn a little bit more about the correctional process. I went on, and my master's studies were in crime prevention, and that's really what we focused on here as I've come in, because there's so many things that lead up to someone being in a position where they violate the law. And oftentimes, by the time someone becomes incarcerated, there's a number of things along the way that we could have, should have seen, and would have had the opportunity to step in and take action to improve upon. And just off the top of my head, a statistic that always stuck with me, anywhere at any given point in time of those 400 persons that were in our custody and care, and Vermont is no different, 80 to 87% at any given point, they were in our custody for a substance abuse related offense, a petty crime to commit, a petty crime to support a substance abuse habit or substance misuse habit, or some type of mental health issue, or a combination of all of that. As I started looking at police use of force, we do an annual use of force, same statistics, 80%. In the 80 percentile range, police use of force. Someone that is under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or a combination of alcohol or drugs and suffering from some type of mental health issue. These are the folks that tend to make their way into the system. They're the ones that tend to have the negative interactions, or we have the negative interactions with. And that's why we've worked very, very hard to make sure we're improving our response. And some of it is recognizing that the police are not necessarily the best response. We can use our authority to do many things. Arresting is just one small piece of that. And we're in the process now across the country about talking about criminal justice reform. It's so important to understand that this is a partnership process. And we work together with the mental health community. We work together with our school district. We work together with family and children's services. We work together with our communities because we all have a stake in the quality of life. And that's the last people factor in this. It's the underlying people factor that we're talking about constantly. What is quality of life? We have a number of rights to help us secure and live the quality of life that we want to live. But at what point does our vision of quality of life infringe on someone else's right and freedom to peace? What happens when folks that have privileges that other people don't have in the community fall prey to some of the horrible things that lead us into the criminal justice system to start with? So we tend to see ourselves, I see ourselves as facilitators in making sure that we're bringing the right resources together to serve all the segments of our community and ensure that we use 2 programs in our community, the Hartford Community Justice Center as well as Court Diversion, Valley Court Diversion. We use them particularly with youth to divert them away from the system and get them engaged in a restorative process. We use mediation, and we've actually worked with 2 classes out of Dartmouth College through their SIP program to study truancy. The way that truancy is dealt with is it's very punitive. It's punitive to the student, it's punitive to the parents. But when we consider that generational poverty and socioeconomic issues drive some of the truancy issues, or really a large part of the truancy issues that we're seeing, getting those kids in school is the best thing that can happen to them. So for us, we wanted to find a way that we could hold students accountable to attending school, hold parents accountable for their kids attending school, but not necessarily punish them in a way that made it more difficult for them to get there or not want to be there in the first place. It continues to be a work in progress, but with Department of Children and Families on board, our school district and the Mediation Center stepping in to help us deal with some of the tough parents that don't think getting their kids in school is an important issue, is a pretty neat thing for us to start working on that problem. I know I just put a lot at you in a short period of time. Listening to me talk can be like drinking out of a fire hose. But I think I have touched on a few things that I think are important from the policing perspective. Again, community policing is thrown out there a lot, but that's really about collaboration and partnerships. It's not a buzzword, it's the real thing. And the more we share information, the more we work together and as a unit to impact broader community changes, the problems that are creating crime and victimization in the community, the better off we're going to be.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do now, I'd like to open it up to our panelists, just any thoughts or reflections that you might have now that you've all heard each other speak and had a chance to sort of mull the threads here, because there are so many great threads that I'm certainly picking up on. And then I'll open it up to questions from our group here. So any reflections on sort of what you've heard and what this panel has brought up for you today?
Well, I can draw from my personal experience. Before I worked at that forensic unit, I used to be the psychiatrist on a mobile crisis team in Middletown, Connecticut. And I cannot tell you how much, and we were always escorted. We requested that the local police department escort us to be there as the authority and the protector of that process, be it for a suicide or a threat of a homicide. And I can tell you that many a time I thought I was part of a SWAT team without weapon than a psychiatrist. And with all the fixings, the door broken down, the talking down, it was, but it worked. When you intervene with clinical professionals to what starts as a social unrest, and upon further exploration and examination, turns out to be the expression and manifestation of a mental disorder. The intervention is totally different, and the outcome is not an arrest. It could be an escort to the local emergency department, which often is the case in my experience. But the legal follow-up had never been brought to court, if you will, because the police was there just to assist.
Wow, that's important, and maybe things are changing, but oftentimes I fear that when the police get to a situation where maybe a person is threatening suicide or whatever, it ends up in a little bit of use of force, and then there's resisting arrest, and then there's assault, and pretty soon, rather than being actually, helped, the person is now arrested and taken to jail.
Yes.
So that's a concern of how we view people in, say, a mental health crisis.
I must say that it was Middletown, Connecticut, used to be called Mental Town. It started in the 1860s when the state built a huge state hospital where actually people worked. We had a farm there. Mm-hmm. It was a real community, and some of the residents, instead of going downtown to Middletown, preferred to stay on hospital property because they were protected. Not to say, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture of life at a state mental institution at the end of the 19th century. There were plenty of other things that could raise your hair on the back of your neck because they were so outrageous. But there was a certain philosophy and concept that people endeavored to emulate and practice. And down the road in the 1990s, when I worked as a mobile crisis psychiatrist, I can assure you that we made an impact in that little enclave that is called Mental Town or Middletown. It worked, and the police officers and the police department was very grateful that they had that sort of approach. I don't have the statistics to prove that we made a dent, nor do I have a way of measuring the impact that the way of dealing with any kind of unrest in the community was generalized. I don't have that, but I can tell you that in Middletown, that was what we practiced alongside the police department.
Dr. Hall?
So I don't know. I've been trying to figure out if I should be completely honest. So I'm going to be completely honest and say that as a rule, I typically feel less safe around police, and that's the history of my community, and it's well founded. I mean, it's not, and that's not a personal comment as much as it is one. That's about institutions and history. And so part of what I was saying earlier about, what does it mean? What does justice mean to you? Not just justice for others, but like justice, what kind of world are you willing to live in? And so I think a lot about prisons as the current manifestation of enslavement. And so if you understand it that way, then the disproportionate numbers make sense. And that's not just me thinking that. That's sort of the documentation rolls out that way. And so what then does that mean? It means that I'm at risk in a way by virtue of being. If you understand that that as lawyers, you all are sort of protecting property, and you understand that I am descended from property, legally speaking, that I'm several generations from being property, then you would see that my understanding of this would have to be different. Like my understanding of sort of why, all of my, so many of my friends and family are captured by this system. Earlier this week, my godmother's son was stabbed and robbed, and I came up here. So let's say Wednesday, I was in the hospital in PG County. That's Maryland. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No. But while he was still in the hospital, I said, well, what would be justice for you? I said, do you want this person? And we think he's a mechanic, not a big guy, so it's definitely not one person. So I asked him. I said, well, what do you want? What do you want to happen? He doesn't want that person to be imprisoned. Neither does his mom. Not like the people in my community who are fighting for justice. Even, he was, and when I say he was stabbed in a robbery, and left there and went to the hospital as a John Doe because he was unconscious. And that's just, I didn't plan that the week before I came to talk on restorative justice. This is sort of this is what it means to sort of live in my community and to be trying to figure out what does justice mean. So it doesn't mean I just don't want prisons, and I just don't want that kind of capture when nothing bad is happening to me. And it means even in the midst of the people who I love the most being injured, I recognize that is not being justice, and they also don't feel that that's not justice. And so that's what I was thinking.
Chief, do you have any thoughts?
Sorry, is he okay now?
So, it's struggling. It's a long story, but, it got close to his kidney, and so they were running a lot of tests. So we were in the hospital for days, and so, I took the overnight bus to, get to Massachusetts. I, spent a couple of hours in Massachusetts and then drove here. So I think he's mostly okay, but the kinds of things, when it's internal and it's blood, it can take a while to figure it out. So he's doing relatively well. We're very glad that he got to a hospital. So.
It's good.
Yeah,
thanks.
I observe a certain dichotomy of attitudes in this society regarding violence. And violence itself is never mentioned it's mentioned in passing to make a point, but when you look at violence for itself, as whatever the manifestation of violence is, one has to pay attention. Violence is freely accepted as a means to achieve an end in our society. That evil is banalized. That's what I meant earlier when I mentioned the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt had quoted in her article. When we start having fun with it, either in the movies or in other forms, we make it acceptable until something happens to us or to somebody we love, and at which point we cry bloody murder, and we want retribution. And for somehow, by imposing another form of violence to the violence that we perceived as was initiated upon us, we achieve some sort of solace, some sort of satisfaction. But that never ends, and that's never achieved. Unless we decide to do something else other than being violent, then we're condemned to repeat it again and again, and there will be no end. That's
well, and there are all these different we's, right? Part of the reason why I told that story was because in the hospital, I said, what does justice look like right now? You're not even out of the hospital yet. Mm-hmm. He just wants his truck fixed and his wallet back. You know what I mean? He doesn't, you know what I mean? So he wasn't crying bloody murder.
Well,
And again, he and his mom, you know what I mean? So like, to see your child, like it's a different level of.
no, I agree with you.
yeah,
I
so.
was not talking about you.
No, but that's why I say it's important to talk about the different we's, even though it's tempting to be in here and say, oh, well, we all agree, and
Yeah, it's an easy
and
path.
they're- I say watch your we's. That's what I say.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's where it all comes back. At the end of the day, we're talking about people.
Yeah.
And, justice is fairness and respect to everyone. And different people define it differently. It means something different to everyone. And some people expect more than others. And to others, finding peace and having peace with what's happened is an important part of their healing process. I do think, and I have seen great success with the restorative process. It tends to not work so well when it's crimes against persons. When people are physically hurt, they tend to be a little bit more vengeful and not be as understanding and not be as willing to feel some level of mercy for someone that has wronged them or wronged someone they care about. But the restorative process helps make people whole. I think the most important thing when we sit back and we think about the correctional process and what it's supposed to do, the bulk of folks that are in the criminal justice system, even if they are incarcerated and we've not done what we should be doing to help divert them from that process, the majority of offenders are going to return to the community. They're going to come back. And I think that's the first thing that everyone needs to keep in mind. Minor offenses, which are the bulk of property crimes, even crimes against persons, simple assaults, people are coming back, and they're going to come back pretty quickly. Most folks, and I mentioned that we had 400 people that were in our care and custody at any given point. They had a sentence that they would serve that was 18 months or less. And they keep them in the local community so that they can return to the local community. The question I think that we have is if we come to the point that we can't divert people from the process and they have to be in our care and custody, what are we doing to help them return? Because they are going to return. How do we reduce the stigma? How do we help people accept folks back into the community that have done a wrong against the community? And we don't address that. Reentry is one of the largest things on the agenda. It's lost a little momentum lately, but for a decade we've been talking about this. And I know our system is not a perfect one. I wouldn't argue that at all. It is far from perfect. And we have a lot of work to do. The good thing is that people are at the center of it. People are involved in supervising it and getting together to talk about things like this. That is how we will improve the process. And there are a number of them that can certainly be helped.
So we're starting to run over time a little bit, but I wonder if we can entertain at least one question from our audience. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to start by saying thank you to our panelists for being here and for sharing your views. It's been a fascinating panel to be a part of and to witness. I'd also like to thank the conference organizers for bringing together a really incredible day talking about some important issues. I've been picking up on a few words that have been part of this conversation. We've been talking about compassion, and we've been talking about vengeance, and we've been talking about judicial discretion. And I think it's the legal system is in such a unique position because it's meant to manage a system of administering justice to help prevent vengeance that people would be seeking on their own. And now we're talking about bringing ideas of compassion into how we administer vengeance and how we administer justice. And it makes me think about differences between enforcing the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and how people who are in a position of enforcement and who are in a position to enact their judicial discretion make those decisions to follow either the letter or the spirit of the law? Are you looking for a minimum sentence? Are you looking for a maximum level of enforcement? And I think I'm curious about what our panelists think about the ways that our biases influence our use of compassion, the level to which we seek enforcement, and who we choose to extend our compassion towards. Because it seems to me that our decision to indulge our compassion, to practice compassion, in some ways has led to an inequitable system of justice, where we extend compassion to some people but not to others, where we seek maximum enforcement for certain kinds of people but minimum levels of enforcement for others. And the effect overall ends up creating a system that is unequal, even though we're trying to bring compassion into the picture. So I don't know if I have a cohesive question out of that, but I'm curious about how you guys see that level of inequality, or that the way that power influence, that power differential influences your roles in that system, or what you're trying to do to prevent that power inequity from continuing.
As a public defender, it's an issue, every day. And how to make a indifferent or worse judiciary look at someone who is poor, someone who may be a person of color, someone who has no, family or whatever to help them, to look at those people as deserving as the, rich white college kids. And that's, it hasn't been that long that we were admonished if we talked about race, and the judge would say, well, don't play the race card. Well, what does that mean? It's every day. How does, I love that. Be careful about the we's. Yeah.
Yeah, because when you said we were admonished for talking about race, I was thinking, oh, she must be talking about white folks.
No, I was just talking about lawyers.
Okay, well, then when you got to the end, then I said, oh, then it must be lawyers. I mean, but, because Michelle Alexander, or, who are we talking about? So that's why I say.
You're absolutely right. And, generally speaking, I was talking about white lawyers in Vermont. Because I need...
It's important clarification.
More people of color to stay and fight.
I also think if I could chime in too, because I've been thinking about your question just from the victim-survivor perspective. And I should add, by the way, that I use those words together interchangeably, because people who've been hurt or harmed by crime sometimes identify by both or either. So I just like to identify that. But I find that people who've experienced crime come to a system sometimes that they've never encountered before. And part of what they expect from that system, that sense of like vengeance or justice, is informed by a cultural sense of this is how we validate what happened to you.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that we can sort of interrupt what ends up happening that is vengeful and unfair is to find other ways to validate people's experiences and honor their stories, because people having the ability to do truth-telling and to be validated in their story is one of the very first steps in healing from a traumatic experience. And so often the criminal justice system is what we offer to be validated. Professor Latham.
Sure, welcome back.
Hi.
Yeah, I just have one quick question for the chief. So I live in Hartford. You mentioned how offenders usually end up back in community. And I don't know if you're there when the business house decided to put in a facility, but that was rather controversial. And could you speak to the role that the business house plays in reintegrating offenders back in the community?
Yep, absolutely. The Dismas House is on Maple Street in Hartford Village, and these are folks that are at the end or nearing the end, or they've been received the opportunity through the court to do their sentence in a community supervision setting. They have a job, they have responsibilities inside the house. It is a house that's been completely refurbished, and there's about 10 to 15 men that are living there in the house, and they have responsibilities inside the house. They have responsibilities externally, as well as activities, and they have different supports and folks that come in and out that assist them as they go through the process of completing their sentence and returning to the community. A tough program to get into.
And ironically, it's, I think, next door to the church, I think. But anyway, the folks who have this church were the biggest opponents of this, which I found very ironic. You know, I thought, what happened to turn the other cheek? But anyway, what do I know about religion? So, but thank you.
Sure. I wanted to respond to the question, the earlier question, because it may be, because I talked about the connection between restorative and reparation, and I recently did a workshop on reparations, and the first day I focused exclusively on the distinction between charity and justice, right? Who needs your compassion? Whose life depends on your compassion, right? People want to be charitable, but who wants to be a charity case, right? And whose life depends on someone taking them up as a charity case? And so the answer to those questions are written into structural inequality. And so when we're talking about compassion and perfection, and I mean, you know, like, yeah, no system is perfect, and some were designed to hurt people. Some were designed to kill people. Some were designed to enslave people. And so it's not perfection. It's just, what was the purpose of this system? So it's not a sort of, and I have to talk about the mural because nobody asked me that question. But the mural upstairs, if you look, so that there's one, it's on this side it says slavery, on that side it says abolition, and on the side where race is mentioned, where it talks about a white slaver, the white slaver is not distinguishably white. They're green and yellow. By the time you get over here to abolition, the white abolitionist suddenly looks like a white human, right? So you talk about seeing your image and knowing that system. I mean, if I show you a picture, if I line up a group of folks, let's say I go to a prayer, I just, pull out some folks and, can you tell without labels which people are guarding, which people are in right? Like, if that information is color-coded in some way, what does that tell you about this? It doesn't have to do with perfection, it has to do with design. Design, institutions, purpose, right? It's fine to be charitable. I'm never or rarely talking about charity. I don't have a great interest in charity. My focus is almost exclusively on justice, which makes people uncomfortable, because I'm not focused on, sort of what you do with your spare time. I want to know what you think is just and right given the history. Do what you want in your spare time.
Well,
we have one last question. Sure.
oh, do you want to take another question? I'm kind of going on your sense of how much longer you want me to go.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rico. I'm actually a restorative justice student here. And I was looking at the drug treatment court model, and in restorative justice, there's a spectrum, so not everything is going to be fully restorative. There's only partial restorative, and I don't think the drug court is fully restorative, but when you look at like addiction and disease and mental health and the resources that people are provided in drug courts, and the empathy of the judge and giving people chances, because when people are addicted to, for example, cocaine or heroin, they're going to require more than one chance, maybe even 20 chances, honestly, to get them to a point where they can be sober on their own. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of just the traditional court sense, is there any way that we can kind of like intertwine like a drug treatment model in the actual court system? Because a lot of times defendants have to be referred to the drug courts or the GUI courts.
Right. Well, that's certainly the case in the federal system here in Vermont. I don't know if you have experience with that, Professor Saxman, but when I was working for the federal magistrate judge for the District Court of Vermont, he and one of the other district court judges operated what they called drug court, but it was within the existing federal case, so it wasn't an alternative. What they would do is just extend out the pretrial phase and extend out the sentencing really long while they, brought in the treatment professionals and had regular meetings in the courtroom and kind of worked people through that way. And then kind of based on that result, it would end up sort of dictating how things went with the case. I think some cases end up resolving in dismissals even, it's sort of depending on how it goes. Often there is a sentencing, but it's just another way, because I think one of the big questions is how do we entice people to participate in treatment without some sort of hook? Go ahead.
Well, I want to share with you a treatment paradigm that is currently in practice. I know of it both in Spain and in Switzerland, where there has been a decriminalization of drug use or possession. So once you're caught with any amount of let's say, the cocaine or marijuana or heroin, you're not arrested or charged. You're taken in charge by social services, and you are considered a patient, not a criminal. And to make a long story short, both models in Spain and in Switzerland have, at the end of it, documented a drastic reduction of substance use just by changing the philosophy. You're not a criminal because you're possessing. You're just a patient in waiting for a treatment and on his way to recovery. And the therapeutic accompaniment follows the person from the time you're caught with that substance, detoxing from heroin, because you don't have detoxing from cocaine or marijuana. There is no such biological evidence to support it. But there is a psychological addiction to it. But you're brought from that point A to detox to the point B where you're in recovery, and the recovery is sustained until you are fully reintegrated in society. I wonder what it would take to have a small test of that concept of decriminalization of possession.
Sure.
A lot, probably. But yes, I think on one hand, what you're saying is, could the principles of getting services to people who are experiencing problems in living, whether it be drugs or some, mental health, yes, that could happen, but the criminal justice system currently in the United States does not operate on helping people with problems in living. So the drug court is a small exception, and there are mental health courts as well.
Yeah.
So it's a tiny fraction of the cases.
So I don't really know much about this area. I mean, what I can say is that it has to do with my personal experience in Massachusetts versus Maryland, thinking about the comparisons between sort of innovative, community-based educational approaches around opioid addictions in Northeast versus how people are talked about and dramatized during, for example, the Baltimore crack epidemic. I mean, you can just watch episodes of The Wire and see how that's playing out differently than how we understand, like how people are moving away from criminalization and towards like community, approaches that has everybody knowing how, how you respond to someone who's overdosing. And I mean, like, there's an entirely different sort of community-based education approach that doesn't pathologize and criminalize the actual person using, at least in my experience in my time in Massachusetts, which is very, very, very different Very different. Now, you might also say that some of that is color-coded.
Treatment courts are a trend that's on the rise. We do have a police social worker on staff that we work with. Yep. It has been a tremendous help with us doing proactive and preventative work. So we follow up with someone, particularly when we receive word that someone has experienced an overdose. We don't necessarily always hear about that now because folks are able to receive naloxone or Narcan on their own, but we're able to use the social worker to follow up with them in advance and really provide a persistent approach to get people get the help that they need. And most things now, even with the prosecutorial discretion, I know that was brought up earlier, even when someone's cited and minor possession is a citation now, the prosecutor tends to work either with restorative justice or one of the treatment programs to work somebody into a treatment program. And that's everybody. That's not just someone that's first time through. We have people that have been repeat offenders, and they continue to try and find a way to assist them. The recent armed robbery that we had in town, I know that we're close to, the court system is close to resolving that case, and I think that treatment will be a priority in the outcome of that.
So we've gone a bit over our time, but I think it's important, and I'm really grateful for our audience for hanging with us because I think this material has been really important. So can we give a warm round of applause? Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's give our panelists another hand. Yep. For you all who don't know me, I'm Shirley Jefferson. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs and Diversity and Associate Professor here at Vermont Law School. First, I'd like the students who organized this conference to please come up. I want us to give them a hand. They worked very hard. There you go. Very hard on this conference. Yep. This is about my 18th Solution Conference. I remember when we first created the first, I'm using we, Vermont Law School students, when we first, and every time I use we, I'm talking about Vermont Law School students. When we first created the Solution Conference, it was to also bring up issues and concerns, but also to find solutions to problems. The students who organized this conference, and I'm not going to talk about our keynote speaker, the ones who were here, you saw her. She was very passionate and dedicated and trying to help folks who suffer from PTSD. And the other panelists, but I'm going to talk about our students and talk about our law school here. The students could have chosen an easy topic to deal with. But this is a difficult, serious issue and problem in this country. When I first took this job 18 years ago, well-being and mental health has become my journey. Why? Because I used to see students who would come here so happy, so poised, so smart. Within some time, a month, the student was unnoticeable, sad, depressed. And when I would talk to them about getting counseling, it was almost like an embarrassment. So I said to myself that I wanted to remove the stigma, just like you said, Chief, stigma from getting help. And I say that because once the student would receive that help, they would become themselves again, but sometime more than themselves. I've watched students leave here who had very stressful experience here on this campus, become judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys. I know what help can do. The students, again, as I said, they didn't just want to put on a conference that was something easy. Our students love a challenge. They do. Because we are raising, and I said raising, but we are, it's almost like raising, but we have the leaders, the next generation of leaders are right out there. There they are. They're the ones who are going to make the changes. And Dr. Hall, you talk about people, like you say, our mothers and our fathers. I grew up in Selma, Alabama. I'm a direct victim of Jim Crow. I came here over 30-some years ago, and this little law school right here gave me an opportunity when no one else would, and you was in my class, Professor Saxman. This school is unlike any other law school in this country. It gives people a chance when no one else would, and we still do that. We have a mission here, and our students are on it. They are on the mission, and I want to thank all of you all, the faculty and the staff, and that 466 audience that we have out there, and thank you, Emily, watching. This has been a great success. You found the solutions to some of the issues and concerns. I'm glad I found out about Open Door. I think that's a very, very good program. Thank you, Doctor. Your son, you just like him, your disclaimer at the beginning, both of you all. I see where your son get that from. Ray, did you run out of here? Oh, he's in class, look. Yes, and Dr. Hall, I'm glad you answered the call. You gotta come back.
Be here.
That's what I'm saying. Thank you for answering the call. You have to come back to this law school. Our doors are open for everyone. Nobody get mistreated here on this campus. Our students are always here to learn. We can learn. I've learned a lot here today. First of all, I couldn't understand how the restorative justice was going to play into the mental health. I said, what type of panel is that going to be? Yeah, that was it. And finally, I said, go ahead, old Professor Saxman. I never looked at the defendant as a victim. Never. And you said that we should not use PTSD as a defense, that we should be looking for solutions. I never thought of it like that. So yes, Dr. Hall, you said you learned. I learned from my students. Yeah. I learned something every day. And I thank them for putting on this panel today, and I thank all of the faculty and the staff that are here, and I want us to keep on continuing enjoying today. We have a reception that we're running over in Yates. So I hope you all would join us, and thank you, and let's give our students who organized this symposium a hand.